My name is Anna. I'm 32, and I've lived in this rented house for just over a year. A charming, old house with large windows and a garden that, despite my efforts, insists on looking wild. The house is on a quiet street, with leafy trees that filter the sunlight. Inside, it has that characteristic smell of old furniture and slightly damp wood. My bedroom is upstairs, the largest in the house, with a view of the neighbor's backyard. The walls are a faded cream color, and it was on one of those walls, near the headboard of the bed, that the web appeared. It wasn't a common spider web. The threads were thin, almost invisible, but they formed a complex pattern, as if someone had embroidered shadows on the wall. And in the center, there was no spider. There was just a cold sensation, a shiver running down my spine, even with the window closed. It's 2025. We believe in so many things we don't see, in invisible waves that carry information, in subatomic particles that defy our logic. Why would it be so hard to believe that something more could exist beyond our plane? The night before, I had a strange dream. I was lost in a labyrinth of dark corridors, and I heard whispers all around me, indistinct voices that seemed to call my name. I woke up with a feeling of anguish, a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake off all day. Small incidents followed, the light from the bedside lamp flickering for no reason, the closet door slowly opening by itself, a faint smell of incense lingering in the air, even though I had never lit anything similar. Common objects, like my silver necklace that I left on the dresser, appeared on the desk, and the feeling of being watched. It was almost palpable, as if invisible eyes were following me all over the house. I tried to convince myself that it was fatigue, stress from my job as an interior designer. But the web on the wall, that web was different. It was a sign, a premonition of something I couldn't comprehend. The days that followed were marked by increasingly disturbing events. The web on my bedroom wall seemed to grow, its threads becoming thicker and darker. Sometimes, I swore I saw small shapes moving within it, like somber insects that disappeared before I could focus my vision. The incense odor intensified, becoming almost suffocating, especially at night. And the whispers. I started to hear them more clearly, not just in dreams, but also when I was awake, especially in the darker corners of the house. They seemed to come from inside the walls, incomprehensible murmurs that sent a chill down my spine. Objects began to disappear and reappear in completely illogical places. My keys vanished from the living room table, and I found them inside the sugar bowl in the kitchen. A book that was on my bedside table appeared on the bathroom floor. My clothes were taken out of the closet and found strangely folded on the bed. It was as if someone, or something, was playing with me, testing my limits. One night, while I was having dinner alone in the kitchen, I heard a loud noise coming from the living room, a sound of something heavy falling. I rushed in and found one of the wall paintings on the floor. It wasn't just any painting. It was an old portrait of the house's former owner, a stern-looking lady who gave me chills just by looking at her picture. The glass was shattered, and a piece of the portrait, precisely where the woman's eyes were, had been strangely removed. Have you ever had that feeling that someone is breathing down your neck when you're completely alone? I started feeling that frequently, especially when I lay down at night. A cold breath, almost imperceptible, that made me wake up with a start, my heart pounding. The terror gradually intensified, ceasing to be merely disturbing and becoming genuinely threatening. Doors opened and closed with violence, even without wind. Slow, dragging footsteps echoed through the hallway at night, going up and down invisible stairs. The television turned itself on in the middle of the night, always on out-of-service channels, displaying only static and noise. And the web. The web in my room now covered almost the entire wall, its threads pulsing with a dark and unsettling energy. In the center, I began to see an indistinct form, like a condensed shadow that seemed to observe me. I started having sleep paralysis frequently. I would wake up in the middle of the night, aware of everything around me, but unable to move or scream. And during these episodes, I saw dark figures hovering over me, felt an oppressive weight on my chest, as if something was trying to suffocate me, and I heard the whispers. Louder. Now. Clearer. I couldn't understand the words, but the intonation was loaded with hatred and suffering. One afternoon, while I was working on my computer, the screen went black for an instant and, when it came back on, there was a single word written in red and blurry letters. Leave. I tried to erase it, but the word reappeared seconds later. I ran a full antivirus scan, but nothing was detected. The feeling that something supernatural was happening was undeniable. But a part of me, the rational part, the part that was trained to look for logical explanations, refused to accept it. Was I going crazy? Was all that terror just a manifestation of my own disturbed mind? Do you know that feeling that a place is charged with negative energy? That something terrible happened there? That was the constant atmosphere inside my house. It was as if the walls were permeated with suffering. I decided to research the history of the house. I talked to neighbors, went to the city hall looking for old records. I discovered that the house was over 100 years old, and that several families had lived there. One of the stories particularly caught my attention, that of a young woman who died in the house in the 1930s. The records were vague, but they mentioned a sudden and mysterious illness. Some older neighbors whispered about a possible suicide, shrouded in sadness and loneliness. I started finding old objects hidden around the house. A porcelain doll with one eye missing in the attic. Old letters tied with a faded ribbon inside, a secret drawer in the desk. A small diary with elegant and melancholic handwriting hidden under the floorboards of my bedroom. The diary entries described the young woman's loneliness, her growing feeling of being watched, her vivid nightmares, and the strange web that seemed to appear on her bedroom walls. It was as if I was reliving the same experience, almost a century later. One night, the web in my room began to vibrate intensely. The shadow in the center became more defined, taking the form of a female figure, pale and thin, with long dark hair covering her face. The smell of incense became unbearable, and the whispers transformed into a painful lament, a silent cry of anguish. I felt an intense cold take over the room, and the figure began to move slowly towards me, extending a translucent hand. In that moment of paralyzing terror, a question echoed in my mind. What is real? What is a product of my imagination? And what is a genuine manifestation of something beyond comprehension? The line between sanity and madness seemed to have completely broken. What I was experiencing went beyond simple supernatural phenomena. There was a strong resonance with the emotional state of the young woman who died in that house. The loneliness, the fear of being watched, the nightmares. These were the same torments she described in her diary, and that I was now experiencing. This leads us to the psychological concept of phantom empathy. In situations of strong emotional charge linked to a place, such as a tragic death, sensitive people can, unconsciously, pick up and even internalize fragments of these past emotions, interpreting them as supernatural manifestations. Another important point is suggestion. Reading the young woman's diary and the stories I heard about the house created an expectation in me, a predisposition to experience similar events. My mind, influenced by this information, may have started to interpret mundane events as supernatural signs, intensifying fear and, in a vicious cycle, generating more evidence of the haunting. It's like when someone believes they are sick and starts to feel all the symptoms of that illness, even if physically there's nothing wrong. We can also consider the concept of place memory. Some psychologists believe that places loaded with traumatic events can retain a kind of emotional memory that can affect the people who inhabit them. This memory would not be a conscious entity, but rather a residual energy that influences the emotional state and even the sensory perceptions of individuals. The web, in this context, could be a symbolic manifestation of this energy, a visual representation of the young woman's anguish and suffering. The figure I saw in my room, the lament, the cold. These could be interpretations of my mind, shaped by the information I had absorbed and by my own state of emotional vulnerability. The intense fear and the feeling of reliving the young woman's story may have triggered sensory hallucinations, making the terror even more real and palpable. The truth is that the boundary between the psychological and the supernatural is often thin and complex. What we perceive as a manifestation of the beyond can, in many cases, have deep roots in our own minds, in our repressed emotions, and in our ability to be influenced by the environment and the stories that surround it. The web of spirits may be, after all, the web of our own psyche, trapping us in our deepest fears. Think about how many places carry sad stories, how much pain can be ingrained in the walls, in the objects, and think about how our own minds can play tricks on us, creating terrifying realities from fragments of the past and present. Perhaps the true ghosts are not those that wander the corridors, but rather those that inhabit the labyrinths of our own minds, and just like the web, they can trap us if we are not careful.
I, Carlos, a man in my early 30s with a well-established routine as a book editor, felt a strange knot in my throat as I crossed the threshold of the two-story house I had inherited from my parents. The walls, painted a pale white, which once brought me a sense of peace, now seemed cold and distant, as if the house itself was shrinking from something invisible. The key turned in the lock with a dry click, echoing in the unusual silence of the 2025 night. Acacia Street, where I had always lived, seemed to breathe differently, charged with a dense atmosphere that clung to my skin, raising the hairs on my arms. In the living room, the faint light escaping from the floor lamp with its old linen shade barely illuminated the outlines of the furniture. The fine dust on the dark wooden coffee table seemed like a shroud, covering the happy memories of a time that would never return. The picture frame on the shelf, with the photo of my parents smiling carelessly, seemed to gaze at me with a silent melancholy, as if they knew what was coming. Even the constant tick-tock of the pendulum clock on the wall, once a comforting sound that marked the steady rhythm of days, now sounded like funeral tolls, announcing something sinister. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling a shiver run down my spine. That's when I noticed it. A subtle metallic odor hung in the air, almost imperceptible, but it caused an instant nausea. The front window was locked, the curtains drawn, preventing any night breeze from entering. And yet, along with the strange smell, came a sound. A low, dragging whisper that seemed to come from within the walls. They weren't clear words, just indistinct murmurs that chilled my blood. I looked at the old mirror hanging above the sofa. My reflection looked pale, my eyes wide, catching a fleeting shadow that moved behind me where there was nothing. The feeling of not being alone intensified, planting the seed of a terror I had never experienced within the familiar walls of my own home. The next morning, the May 20th, 2025 sun timidly entered through the kitchen window's cracks. I tried to ignore the previous night's events, attributing everything to tiredness and an overactive imagination. I made coffee, watching the warm steam rise from the white ceramic mug. The chrome toaster, a gift from my parents, reflected my tense face. But, as I picked up the bread, I noticed something strange. Small scratched marks adorned the smooth surface of the granite countertop, thin scratches that hadn't been there the night before. I ran my finger over them, the rough texture contrasting with the cold sheen of the stone. A pang of anxiety hit me. Could I have done that while sleepwalking? It had never happened before. During the day, I tried to focus on work, reviewing an intriguing manuscript about the primordial fears of childhood. Irony of fate, I thought. But the persistent feeling of discomfort remained. Late in the afternoon, returning home, I noticed something disturbing in the front garden. The rose bushes my mother loved so much were strangely contorted, as if an invisible force had twisted them. One of the red roses, the most vibrant, lay on the ground, its petals scattered like drops of blood. A chill ran down my body. That was not the wind's doing. That night the whispers returned, more audible, more insistent. They came from the walls, from the floor, even from the ceiling. I couldn't identify words, but the intonation was unmistakable. Suffering, anguish, perhaps even rage. I lay in bed, the rough cotton sheet against my skin, and covered my ears with my hands, but the whispers seemed to penetrate my bones. I looked at the nightstand beside the bed. My cell phone, a recent model with integrated artificial intelligence, was off. Suddenly the screen lit up on its own, showing a text message from an unknown number. "You are not alone." Fear paralyzed me, my heart beating frantically in my chest. The cell phone message put me on high alert. I picked up the device, trying to trace the number, but I had no success. It was a strange code with no identification. Paranoia began to set in, insidious like a parasite. I looked around the room, every familiar object now carrying an aura of threat. The solid wooden dresser where I kept old photos seemed somber, guarding secrets. The heavy curtains swayed slightly, even without wind, as if someone were watching them from behind. That night I decided to stay awake, decided to stay. I made strong coffee and sat in the living room armchair, watching the darkness outside through the window. The street was deserted, lit only by the yellowish streetlights that cast long, distorted shadows. The silence was almost palpable, broken, only by my anxious breathing and the insistent tick-tock of the clock. Suddenly, a sharp noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something breaking. My body stiffened. I picked up the heavy lamp from the nearby table, using it as an improvised weapon, and advanced cautiously down the dark hallway. The kitchen was a mess. The cabinet door under the sink was open, and pieces of white ceramic were scattered across the floor. My favorite coffee mug, the same one I used that morning, was shattered into 1,000 pieces. But what was most disturbing was what was written on the countertop, scribbled with something dark and viscous. "He is near." The trembling letters seemed to have been made in haste with despair. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who had entered my house? How? And what did that sinister message mean? Projection is a defense mechanism in which we attribute our own unacceptable feelings, desires, or thoughts to other people. Was I projecting my own fears and anxieties onto my house, onto my neighborhood? Was all of this a product of my disturbed mind? The idea was terrifying, the possibility of losing control of my own sanity. In the following days, the strange events intensified. Objects moved by themselves. Doors opened and closed without explanation. The metallic smell grew stronger, sometimes accompanied by a rancid odor, like decaying flesh. The whispers became clearer, sounding like muffled voices calling my name. I began to have difficulty sleeping, tormented by vivid nightmares in which shadows pursued me through the corridors of my own house. One night I woke up with a start, feeling a paralyzing weight on my chest. It was sleep paralysis, a phenomenon I had experienced a few times before, but that night it seemed to have a malignant presence. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, just observe the dark room with growing terror. A tall, shapeless shadow hovered in the corner, its outlines indistinct but its presence oppressive. I felt an intense cold, as if the temperature had dropped sharply. The shadow seemed to move towards me, and an icy whisper invaded my ears, so close I felt its cold breath on my face. "You will be ours." The experience of sleep paralysis left me exhausted and terrified. The line between reality and nightmare seemed increasingly thin. I began to doubt my own perception, questioning whether all of this was not a manifestation of some latent psychological problem. I searched online for information about hallucinations, about the fragility of the human mind under stress. But deep down, I knew that what was happening went beyond any rational explanation. One afternoon, while organizing some old papers in the dusty attic, I found an old diary, bound in worn leather, It belonged to my grandmother, who had lived in that house before my parents. The elegant calligraphy on the yellowed pages described a series of strange events that had occurred in the house decades ago. Whispers in the walls, objects moving, a constant feeling of being watched. She spoke of a trapped spirit, of an ancient tragedy that happened on the street, involving a family of Latin immigrants. A local legend I vaguely remembered hearing as a child. My grandmother mentioned a constant fear of losing her sanity, a fear that the house was cursed. She described recurring dreams of a shadowy figure watching her from the corner of the room. Reading that diary sent a deep chill down my spine. My grandmother's experiences were eerily similar to mine. Could the house truly be haunted? Or was there a family predisposition to some kind of psychological disorder that made us share the same hallucinations? Freud believed that traumatic events can be banished from our consciousness, but continue to influence our behavior and emotions in unconscious ways. Could it be that the tragic history of the street, mentioned in my grandmother's diary, had left a psychic mark on the place, affecting everyone who lived there? Was it possible that I was in some way reliving the terror of a forgotten past? That night I decided to investigate the legend mentioned in the diary thoroughly. I went to the municipal library and searched the old local newspaper archives. I found a 1958 report about the disappearance of a Mexican family who lived on Acacia Street. They were never found. The report mentioned rumors from neighbors about screams in the night and a strange atmosphere that hung over the house where they lived, the same house where I now lived. A pang of icy terror ran down my body. The legend seemed to fit perfectly with the events that were happening. Back home, the atmosphere felt even heavier. The whispers were almost constant now, like a funeral chorus surrounding me. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked distorted, with deep dark circles under my eyes and a look of pure terror. Suddenly, the image in the mirror changed for an instant. For a fraction of a second, I saw the reflection of a pale, suffering face looking at me before returning to my own. I almost fell backward, my heart pounding. I wasn't imagining things. There was something else there, something dark and persistent. The vision in the mirror was the turning point. The doubt about my sanity began to dissipate, replaced by a visceral and undeniable fear. I wasn't crazy. There was something wrong with the house, with Acacia Street. The story of the disappeared family in 1958 hung over me like a shadow, connecting the dark past to my terrifying present. That night, the events reached a new level of intensity. I was in the living room, trying to read my grandmother's diary, when the television turned on by itself. The static screen glowed intensely, filling the room with a sharp hum. I tried to turn it off, but the button didn't respond. Suddenly, the static disappeared, and the screen showed grainy images of a family. A man, a woman, and 2 small children. Terror invaded me when I realized that the woman's features were incredibly similar to mine. Could it be them? The disappeared family. The image on the screen began to distort, the faces contorting into expressions of pure dread. Then, a man's hoarse voice filled the room, coming from the television speakers. "You will never let us go." The television abruptly turned off, leaving a deafening silence. I felt a shiver run down my spine. They were there, trapped, and somehow, I was connected to them. I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. I grabbed the flashlight and went up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The whispers intensified with each step, seeming to come from all sides at once. I reached the attic, the air heavy and dusty. The only source of light was the trembling beam of my flashlight, revealing dancing shadows and old objects covered in white sheets. In the corner of the attic, near an old foggy window, I saw something that paralyzed me with terror. A pale, thin figure stood there, motionless, watching me with empty, suffering eyes. It was the image I had seen in the mirror, but now in flesh and blood. Or whatever it was. A silent scream caught in my throat. The figure raised a trembling hand towards me, and a hoarse whisper echoed in the attic. "Help us." At that instant, the truth revealed itself in my mind like a lightning bolt in the dark night. The house was not just haunted, It was trapped in a cycle of suffering, repeating the tragedy of the disappeared family. And somehow, my presence there, my family connection to the place had reopened old wounds, freeing these tormented souls and, at the same time, making me part of their nightmare. The fear of losing my sanity was replaced by an even greater terror, the fear of losing my own life, of being dragged into the abyss of that forgotten tragedy. The figure in the attic was not threatening, just infinitely sad. Its empty eyes seemed to carry the weight of decades of suffering. The whisper, "Help us," echoed in my mind, awakening in me a strange compassion amidst the terror. I realized they didn't want to hurt me, but rather to find the peace that had been stolen from them. At that moment, I remembered an old, popular belief, almost a Latin American folklore my grandmother sometimes mentioned, the need to free trapped souls through remembering and acknowledging their history. Perhaps the fact that I had found the diary, that I had discovered the truth about the family's disappearance, was the first step to breaking the cycle. I decided I would try to help them. I spent the next few days researching more about the family. I discovered their names: Miguel, Sofia, and their children Isabella and Mateo. They were immigrants who came seeking a better life but found a tragic end on that street. The report mentioned the prejudice and hostility they faced in the community. A dark clue emerged in my mind. Could it be that they hadn't just disappeared? I talked to older neighbors, some who still remembered the time. One of them, an 80-something woman named Anna, told me a terrible story. There were rumors that the family had been victims of a hate crime motivated by xenophobia. Their bodies were never found, and the investigation was mysteriously closed. The truth was much darker than I could have ever imagined. On the night of May 31st, 2025, I gathered some objects I found in the attic that seemed to belong to the family. A small wooden toy, an unfinished embroidery, faded photographs. I took everything to the garden, to the spot where my mother's rose bushes were twisted. I lit a small bonfire and began to speak aloud about Miguel, Sofia, Isabella, and Mateo. I told their story, their struggle, the injustice they suffered. As I spoke, the wind began to blow softly, and the whispers around me gradually diminished as the flames consumed the objects. I felt a change in the house's atmosphere. The heavy air dissipated. The metallic smell disappeared. In the night sky, the stars shone more intensely. The next day, Acacia Street seemed to have returned to normal. The silence was no longer oppressive, but peaceful. The feeling of being watched vanished. However, upon entering the living room, I noticed something in the old mirror. It wasn't my reflection staring back at me, but for a brief moment I saw the pale faces of Miguel, Sofia, Isabella, and Mateo, no longer filled with suffering, but with a serene expression, almost of gratitude. Then the image dissipated, and my own tired face looked back at me. I felt an immense relief, the certainty that they had finally found peace. But as I looked away from the mirror, I noticed something new on the shelf, next to my parents' picture frame. A small wooden toy, a little horse with chipped paint, exactly like the one I had burned in the bonfire the night before. A chill ran down my spine. Their spirits had found peace, but what about the objects? Could the house hold other memories, other tragedies, waiting to manifest? And I, Carlos, would I be forever trapped on Acacia Street, the link between the dark past and an uncertain future, where mind and terror intertwined in ways I was only beginning to comprehend? The distant whisper I heard at that instant didn't come from the walls, but from deep within my own head, cold and undeniable. You are one of us now.